Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui and live. Elections for local people's congresses are currently being held across China and will continue till next year. Some Western critics have argued that it's an election in name only. However, China will not adopt the Western-style elections and chooses instead to continue democratic experiments in its own way. How should we look at the controversies over Chinese elections? Why does China adopt a different electoral system from others? And what progress has it made? To discuss all these issues and more, today I'm pleased to be joined by Tao Jingzhou, Managing Partner of Descartes LLP China Practice, and Victor Gao Zhikai, Current Affairs Commentator. Before we get started, let's look at this.
On November the 15th, about 9 million people voted in the capital Beijing. Chinese President Xi Jinping also cast his ballot. 12,270 voting stations were set up in the city for the election of over 14,000 deputies to people's congresses in townships and counties. This grassroots election was also mirrored nationwide over the past week. In Shanghai, Huang Yufen arrived at the voting station early in the morning, accompanied by her family. Although already 94 years old, she insisted on casting her vote by herself. Yang Genfang, on the other hand, was carefully reading the candidates' resumes before she was ready to vote. At another voting station in Shanghai, people were also expressing their enthusiasm for participation.
很郑重地把这一票投给了我信任的人，然后我希望被选上的人大代表以后呢，多为我们村民做一些实事。
Under China's current electoral law, deputies to people's congresses in townships and counties are elected directly by voters. They in turn elect deputies to people's congresses of cities, who then elect deputies at the provincial level. NPC deputies are elected by people's congresses of provinces, autonomous regions and municipalities.
Now, gentlemen, what do you think of the use of ballot box in Chinese politics? Obviously, something's going on throughout the country.
I think it's a direct election is certainly a constitutional arrangement under which the town representative must be elected by people directly. This is a fundamental system of China.
Victor, do you agree that this is just the beginning of a political process that the Western viewers would follow very, if not very seriously, at least with a strong mixed feeling?
Well, for observers outside of China, especially in Western countries, they find the Chinese election something very puzzling to them, mainly because on the one hand they believe China is a one-party system dominated by the Communist Party of China. Therefore, by definition, the elections are not democratic by their definition. Therefore, when they find that in China we do have grassroots direct election of the delegates to the local People's Congress by the people themselves, they find that untenable, something very difficult for them to fully understand. Whereas in China, the direct election is happening as we speak, not at all levels of the People's Congress, but at the very lower level, the grassroots. But that's a reality that we welcome and encourage, and hopefully in the future it can be more elevated to the higher levels.
Let's take a closer look at some of the concepts you guys have used in the early part of the discussion. What is a direct election, and does it mean one man, one vote? In the United States, it's not actually one man, one vote. The outcome is actually decided by the tickets, the electoral tickets. So what do you think of the Chinese way of exercising democratic rights?
That's one vote, one man for one vote. So that's the direct election. While U.S. presidential election is by one winner take all principle. If you win in one state, then the whole state, electoral vote will belong to you. So it's not a direct election; it's an indirect election.
I'm a little bit cautious as to a direct comparison. parallel comparison between the American political institutions, which are entirely different from ours, and the Chinese political system. So, Victor, are you a little bit embarrassed or kind of very cautious in doing whatever comparison?
Well, first of all, the pursuit for democracy, I think, is generally applicable to many countries in the world, including in China. However, the shape and form of how these democratic practices will take shape is very, very different. It varies from one country to another. The US system is very, very unique, but it's not being implemented in any other country in the world. If you look at European countries, including France, for example, they follow very, very different specific procedures and processes. In China, we started the so-called democratic elections more recently, much more recently compared with more developed countries. And we are still doing experiments. I don't think that today's version will be the final version. China is making progress over the coming years and decades, and eventually we may actually come up with a better way. But the current way is also working in the Chinese characteristic, given the specific requirements on the ground in China.
And in fact, the practice of electoral politics started from 1988, when the National People's Congress passed the organic law of a village committee election. I went to many villages to cover the local elections, and I did some stand-ups when I was a reporter of CCTV-News. I even interviewed Mr. Jimmy Carter, former US president, on the site of at least 2 village elections. One of them was in Zhouzhuang, a very beautiful township in Jiangsu province. So the thing is, in the village committee elections, they had the multiple candidates. What does that mean, to have multiple candidates instead of only having one official candidate recommended by the ruling party, the Communist Party of China here?
Yeah, you do have some independent candidates. You know, normally the candidate will be recommended by the party, by the local government, but you do have sometimes independent candidate emerged, and I think what we should do is to make maybe the selection process more transparent, so that people know that how many candidates will be in that county or in that town, and to make the candidate more close to the local people. That's something I think needed to be improved in China.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the issue of transparency for the whole process of the electoral practice? I mean, I wouldn't call it electoral politics. What do you think, Victor?
Well, in theory, the more candidates to a particular seat for the election to happen is better, because in that case, people or the voters will have a greater choice. They can pick and choose among different candidates. In reality, in China, at the elections at the city level and above, at the provincial level or at the National People's Congress level, it's all indirect election, meaning the candidates are actually not volunteered by themselves or through a more democratic process. It's more or less being predetermined by a fixed process, and participation in that process is minimum. Why? Because the ruling party in China has its own way of vetting the candidates, and they come up with a recommended list, and sometimes the recommended candidates are exactly the number of the seats available. So in that case, the election is a little bit more artificial. But I would say, when the Communist Party of China does the screening and vetting, they actually have a very rigorous process to make sure that the candidates are up to the standards, they satisfy all the pre-requirements, etc. So I think it's a more complicated system. It's not exactly what the Western countries would prefer to understand, but it works in China.
Yeah, in some area, I think they put like 10% more candidates, so that you can cherry pick, among 110, you just pick 100. I think at least this gives some kind of a free choice.
What does the Constitution say about the candidacy? Can anyone above the age of 18 stand for their political positions, can apply for the candidacy?
Yes, you have to be over 18, and you have to get 10 people support your candidacy.
What about their ethnicity, their skin color, their sex, gender?
No discrimination.
No discrimination.
On the age,
in theory,
party,
anyone that can live up to the expectations and the conditions could apply. So what do you think, Victor?
There should be no discrimination based on color of the skin or sex, gender, for example. However, in China, we also have our own characteristics, mainly because we have sometimes the autonomous regions or autonomous cities or counties, and in those autonomous regions, actually the people of certain ethnic groups get a preference because you need to have a minimum number of these ethnic minorities to sit in number of the seats at the parliament or at the Congress, and that means there is actually a reverse preference for certain in China, and it works fine, mainly because the Han population still accounts for more than 92-93% of the total population, and I think the more people from different minorities to sit in the Congress, the better.
Yeah, it's an issue of representation from the remote border areas, mountainous areas where you have more of the ethnic groups. They need to get their voices heard in the local legislature. Now, I went to the village elections many years ago, because I founded the reporting team of CCTV-News, and I was impressed by the overseas media. They showed tremendous interest in their interviews with local villagers who cast their vote in the ballot box. They would always ask the same question. Today you vote for the village head. Tomorrow, do you expect to vote for presidency of the whole country? And you know what the villagers said? They would say, no, I don't care about tomorrow, the whole country. I'm talking about the village level. So. But this time around, there's no exception, because the BBC did an interview with an independent candidate, and the local authorities showed extreme cautions, and even police were mobilized to push away the BBC correspondent. That caused a lot of debates and controversies on the social media. Now, Victor, why do you think the local authorities were so nervous about the presence of the overseas media? Do you think they should be allowed to conduct independent interviews with independent candidates?
Yeah. As a general point, I actually support media, including both domestic Chinese media as well as Western media, to play a more positive role in covering the elections in China. Anywhere
overseas
in
media
China
would always be very negative.
Yeah.
To be critical of things would be regarded always as their duty, their profession.
But I think people here in China, including the government and the population at large, should have a new way of looking at the role of the media. The media is there, to criticize. They are not there to become cheerleaders.
And overseas media criticize their own government. They supervise their own ruling party.
That's why if we change our own presumption, we could actually be more tolerant of a more critical media, both the domestic as well as the Chinese. We should not lose our own sanity once the media is criticizing one part of China or the other part of China. Eventually, we will reach a high level of tolerance.
In fact, taking the State Council Information Office an example, many training programs have been held to train spokespersons and to issue white papers about transparency or whatever critical issues that the overseas media show their concern about. So the spokespersons, they need to be trained about how to handle or deal with the overseas media. I'd like to have your take as to the image of a government spokesperson. Do they have to be horrified or scared by the presence of the overseas media in a local election? What should they say?
Yeah, I think these local officials, they have hardly have any experience in dealing with foreign media. So they are kind of panic with the presence of those, press people. They don't know how to do. The best way is to prevent them from performing their duty. So this.
But is that a very good form of administration, to simply practice prevention and control instead of having very effective communication with the overseas media?
They should. I think the government should train these local officials to how to deal with this negative.
Because China is getting increasingly integrated with the rest of the world. You cannot prevent the overseas media from, doing interviews. So
I think
in theory, following the 2008 Beijing Olympics, the overseas media players could be allowed to travel freely around the country.
Yeah.
That's a lifting of the previous ban, which was notorious from the Western perspective.
Yeah, that's why we should not go backward. If in 2008 we can do that, why in 2016 we can no longer do that?
No, I think as a goal, China as a country should accept media to play a much more independent role, and the government should not interfere or intervene in what the media is doing. If some people in the media circle practice, for example, misinformation or distort the real facts, then that's another matter. Media playing a role.
What if they were to be denied access to the sources of information? Would they spread lies? They would say, "Oh, forgive me for telling honest lies because I've been denied access to the source, legitimate source and reliable source of information." So what should local governments do to encourage sufficient and equal access to the same source of information?
No, I think as a first point, the local governments should be very open-minded in dealing with media, both domestic as well as foreign. Secondly, they could actually set up benchmarks whereby the media agencies or media professionals need to abide by, for example, and they should be more proactive in providing more information available to the media, and they should not deny access to the media if they really want to interview anyone in the society.
And also,
the more transparency, the better.
Right. Also,
Yes.
I think we should recommend all these foreign medias to bring Victor with them so that he can try to
Or Tao
convince
Jingzhou.
him.
So they should bring Tao Jingzhou with them, okay? And let them know, Gary relax.
Right, yeah.
Have fun. Don't be so serious. I mean, China is a rising big power with a sufficient degree of, confidence. Yeah, the confidence is the key issue. But you are watching dialogue with Tao Jingzhou and Victor Gao Zhikai. We are discussing what messages we should deliver to the rest of the world through the ongoing local elections to elect the people's deputies at the local level of the legislature. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Now, we are discussing the Chinese politics, okay? Certainly we are not a Western democracy. We don't have a very strong opposition voice in the parliament. Western media, ironically, would call the functions of the legislature at different levels just the rubber stamp. Well, China is making progress quietly. Having said this, now, what do you think of this attitude of the Western media or politicians or whatever? They would say, if you do not take side with us, if you don't adopt our electoral system, then you'll be an enemy, you'll be ridiculous, you are just utterly unacceptable. So whatever that is different from our institutions would be viewed as inhuman crimes, if not crimes. They would go to extremes to portray the different political system as so alien, so ridiculous. What do you think of their attitude in black and white terms?
I don't think that the National People's Congress is a rubber stamp because they really have a very democratic process, for example, for drafting law in China, and they have a lot of consultation with universities, different companies, try to build up consensus for the promulgation of law. So in that sense, at least, it's not a rubber stamp.
Right. Rubber stamp sounds like just unconditionally following the party's will. However, what do you think of what is termed deliberative democracy or consultative democracy? Basically, John Nesbitt, author of Megatrend, did a lot of extensive research at the local level about the Chinese politics. And he came up with wording such as vertical democracy. Was the Professor Zhang Weiwei from Fudan University, who talks about Chinese politics in comparison with the Western system, would say, what we do is a consultative democracy. So what ideas would you adopt in telling the China story?
Well, first of all, some of the bias that Western media professionals have about the Chinese system is based on their tendency to believe that whatever they have is the only truth, is nothing but the truth, and all the other alternatives may not work because they are not the truthful version by comparison to what they have. Now, in reality, there is no monopoly of truth. I think different countries, based on their conditions, may come up with very, very different alternatives to practice democracy. On the other hand, I think how to enable people to express their desire and to enable their will to be executed so that people do not have grievances and people's will are reflected in the government policies, etc. That's very important. In China, even though we have only one ruling party and the 8 other democratic parties and society at large are also involved in democracy, but not as the ruling party, and there is no alternation or rotation of the ruling party, etc. That's a very unique feature of the Chinese democracy. But it doesn't mean that we do not negotiate or consult with each other to try to get to the root causes of every issue and come up with a better way of solving the problems. That's the challenge here in this country. And the way we solve our challenges are very, very different from the Western democracies.
When we look at the issue of alternatives to the Western choice of their political system or judiciary, legislation. Now let's look at what happened in the Philippines. The newly elected president of the Philippines has been on loggerheads with his American counterpart, President Obama, simply because he drew scathing fire and scrutiny from the United States for his war against crimes and drugs in the street. Now, whoever take drugs or sell drugs would be shot. They would get shot. So from day one of his war against such crimes, the criminal rate declined sharply. It works in the Philippines, but the United States would say you have to follow the law, the procedures, justice. You have to have endless hearings, evidence, defense, and whatever in the court. But he didn't do that. He would just let's shoot them. Shoot them indiscriminately. You disagree?
Yeah, no, of course, if you rule by terror with a lawless country such as the Philippines, it's easy to make crime shut down. But it's not really rule of law because you have to observe your own law published by your own country. I'm sure that the Philippines has a law, and they have this judicial process. So the president
Excuse
should
me,
not.
Jingdou, I use the phrase of war. It's a war, ongoing war against the crimes. Now, what happened in the war zone, in battleground? Do you follow the law all the time? For example, are you sure that no POWs got executed by the firing squads of the enemy side? I mean, Victor, President Duterte used the phrase of a war, having a war, staging a war against the criminals in the streets. And therefore, do you mean this is a practice of Filipino exceptionalism under extreme circumstances?
Now, first of all, I actually support what President Duterte is doing in the Philippines in fighting against the drug abuse. Mainly because countries do vary, and if you look at the situation in the Philippines, drug is becoming such a curse on the population, and lots of people lose their lives. And there is no effective way to deal with the drug dealers in the Philippines, and I think President Duterte comes up with this very unique and extraordinary manner. The purpose of which is to deal with this drug problem at the root of the problem.
Right, the crux of the issue. I want to bring you guys back to the local elections and the practice of Chinese democracy here in the local election. The crux issue, I'm afraid, is what works in China may not be accepted in the West. So this is why I raised the example of the Filipino politics shooting the criminals in the street. That led directly to the remarkable progress in law and order in the streets of Manila or other major cities across the whole country. So what works in China may not be accepted by our Western friends. Therefore, what do you think of the Chinese way, consultative democracy? Is it a cliche? Is it an excuse to make China different from something that may lead to color revolution or Arab Spring?
Yeah, personally, I've been involved in the consultative democracy practiced in China on many, many occasions, mainly because the ruling party in China at the central government level or the provincial, city, local level, for example, will normally engage in consultative democracy by, for example, circulating the draft documents to all the democratic parties, people with distinctions in the society, to pre-review them and come up with their comments. And then the ruling party will collect all the different comments, come up with a new version, recirculate it again, etc. So in a sense, the viewpoints and the positions, sometimes criticisms from different circles of the life in China could be collected and reflected eventually in the final document. That in itself is the Chinese way of gathering information, making sure that the legislation or the government decisions are properly made. It's different from the debate in the parliament in the UK or the debate in the Congress in the United States, but the purpose is more or less the same. That is, the people in different walks of life will be able to talk about it and come up with recommendations.
The last issue that we have to address very seriously is whether we should have full-time people's deputies or lawmakers in the legislature, whether they should be concurrently in the government, working for the government. In the West, no. Lawmakers got to be full-time, professional lawmakers. But in China, a majority of them are from the judiciary, the procuratorate, the courts, and the government. So their legitimacy is called into question by the Western, skeptical Western observers.
No, I think no country have this permanent representative sit there just for sitting there. So they must still close to the people, working in their original organizations, so that they can hear the voice of the people. So to have a permanent one is not a good option, in my opinion.
And I think countries do vary. In the US system, for example, the members of the Senate or the members of the House of Representatives at the federal level are permanent members of Congress. But even in state legislatures, they actually are part-time in many states. And in other countries like Germany, for example, or France or UK, many of these members of parliament are not full-time based. They actually have their own jobs, they have their own professions, and then whenever the parliament convenes, they need to perform their duties as the members of the parliament. And I think probably that's a better way, really.
In 2013-15, provincial legislators in Hengyang, Hunan, the second largest city in Hunan, were found to have offered 110 million yuan in bribes to hundreds of city lawmakers and election staff members to get elected. Now, in the United States, we have money politics. We have the fundraising for different presidential hopefuls. Very quickly, do you think this practice should be
allowed,
legalized? The American way, Victor, very quickly.
No, I think to pay for the votes from people to elect you or someone else to be a member of the parliament or member of the Congress is the wrong thing. And I think it's a crime to be punished. The American way is to raise money from interest groups or from individuals so that they have enough political power to get themselves elected.
The money politics is one of the major issues in the U.S. presidential campaign. We'll be back to discuss these and other issues concerning the presidency of Donald Trump. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.